Welcome to the 19th lecture in the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series. It's been a very interesting ride since January 2021, and it's nice to be able to be together for the 19th lecture today, the 24th of November 2023. We have the pleasure to welcome Professor Samantha Vice, who will be delivering today's lecture. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you, Samantha, with us. I mean, you hardly need introduction because of your very impressive work in the area of race. Particularly in your interesting analysis of white privilege and white guilt. And of course, you've contributed greatly to ethics and social political philosophy in general. Samantha Vice is a distinguished professor at Wits University in South Africa, and we'll be listening to her speak on the theme self-respect and integrity in a racially unjust world. One of your most recent work published last month is The Ethics of Animal Beauty, and I really am looking forward to reading that as well. You are very popularly known for your 2010 essay. What's the title again? Yeah, how do I live in this strange place? And that got a lot of people talking about white privilege and white guilt, and so on. So we really are looking forward to your lecture, and we ask everyone to keep muted for now. And after the lecture, we'll have opportunities for questions and comments. So Sam, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Elvis, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about white privilege again today. And in particular, I'm interested in continuing to think about the notion of work on the self that I've been thinking about for a number of years. But today I'm interested in the possibility of cultivating or maintaining certain valuable traits of character in conditions of systemic injustice. So works by many philosophers in the feminist tradition and philosophers of race have explored how both victims and beneficiaries of injustice are morally damaged by that injustice. And in particular today, I'm going to be concerned with the character qualities of integrity and self-respect. On all accounts of self-respect and most accounts of integrity, these traits are morally admirable. The good or virtuous person has both of them, and part of living a moral life is to ensure that one retains them. Losing integrity or self-respect is ethically damaging, and it's a substantial criticism to say of someone that they've lost them or that they never had them. So in unjust societies, it's clear enough that the self-respect of the less privileged can be undermined. Calls for consciousness raising respond to this, as the oppressed need to recover or develop a sturdy sense of self-worth. Integrity has been less discussed, but calls to fight against injustice assume that one's integrity is at stake if one doesn't stand up to oppression or attempt to lead a life that's not merely the passive product of coercive forces. And one is required to, or it hopes, that one can assert one's equal moral worth. Many explorations of moral damage are concerned with both of these virtues, even if they're not explicitly named as such. Now, the self-respect and integrity of those who are on the privileged or the oppressor side is less explored for understandable reasons. You might think that the privileged have had too much attention already. But despite this, I'm going to focus on them today. When we speak of dismantling injustice and privilege, we mean more than structural changes. We also want those who are privileged to admit to their privileged position and to see it as a result of injustice and not, for instance, good luck or merit. We want people to change, not only structures of outward appearance. In fact, I believe it is impossible to radically change structures without people undergoing profound moral change as well. So today, I'm interested in racially unjust societies, and I explore those who are racially privileged because of ongoing structural and systemic injustice, rather than those who are overtly or intentionally discriminatory towards others. Formal discriminatory legislation may have ended, but its history has ongoing and deep effects, politically, economically, socially, and personally. So I have in mind a country like post-apartheid South Africa, and I'm going to speak throughout as a white South African. So under these conditions in which personal responsibility is diffused, it is more accurate to speak of privilege than oppression. So that's what I'm going to do today, though not much hangs on it for my talk. While I will focus on privilege that is race-based, the issues I'm interested in will, I think, arise in some other kinds of group-based structural privilege, for example, gender. So in these conditions, questions of moral character become more complex, because although the privilege may not be directly causally implicated, they're not simply innocent and exempt from responsibility either. They are implicated in the injustices, and they continue to benefit from them, even if each person's particular causal influence cannot be identified, and even if structural injustices exist independently of their individual actions. They are implicated because it is correct to identify them as members of a privileged racial group that continues to benefit from a history of racial inferiority and superiority. White people in post-apartheid South Africa and in most countries clearly need to recognize the harms that racial discrimination caused in the past and continue to cause in more diffuse ways now. Such recognition is morally required, and I will argue that it's required in order to maintain self-respect and integrity. My question, however, is how a racially privileged person can retain self-respect and integrity in these kinds of conditions. Just want to check that my screen is still sharing. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'm interested in also in whether they can be retrained and in what kinds of forms. And I don't think there's a simple answer to this question, because as I'll argue, undertaking the moral project can itself undermine just those virtues that we're trying to sustain. I think another dimension of moral damage is revealed here. And I think it's interesting to look at this because it shows how complex work on the self becomes under non-ideal and systemically unjust conditions. Now, I'm unfortunately not going to reach any solution to this problem, and my thoughts here remain really tentative. But complexifying ethical issues is another way of taking reality into account, so I think it's worth doing. Right. Before I dive in, I want to quickly do a bit of preliminary work. Firstly, I want to talk about the racial terms that I'm going to use. I'm going to use black and white. And these are the terms that are standard in South African context. Different terms might be useful and required in other parts of the world, but I'm going to use them to capture those who were benefited and who were oppressed during apartheid South Africa. By privilege, I mean a couple of things, and I'll just go through this quickly. I mean problematic habits of being in the world that are often habitual and work underneath the level of consciousness. So things like being complacent, entitled, being arrogant, assuming that our ways of doing things are the normal ways. I also have in mind material or status goods and the benefits that go with them. In this sense, privilege is a group-based, relative and pejorative notion. The members of one group are privileged relative to another, and their goods or privileges are related in some significant way to a history of injustice. So in the way I'm using the word, to call someone privileged is to say that they are in some way in the wrong. There's another kind of privilege that is relevant, and I'm thinking of what Lisa Tessman here calls a privilege to think well of ourselves. She says the people I'm concerned with, those who maintain themselves in unjust social locations, will actually have a structurally supported tendency to believe in their own virtue and in the goodness and happiness of their lives. And I think there's something true about it, and I'm going to come back to it. But at the same time, the people I'm interested in are also those who recognize that their lives do require evaluation. They're what I'll call morally conscientious, and are concerned with improving themselves morally. So let me say now something about integrity and self-respect. They are what I call self-regarding virtues, to indicate that there are admirable character traits that fundamentally concern a particular relation we have to ourselves. They do also have a social dimension, and they're expressed in how you relate to others. But I think it's useful to think of them in the first instance as relations to the self. And I'll start by talking about integrity. Integrity is a complex concept, and there are differing accounts of it that don't always overlap. We can speak of integrity in certain spheres of life and not others. For instance, having artistic or professional integrity. But I'm going to be concerned with overall integrity, with being a person of integrity, which is in all things considered judgment of character. While there are different accounts, as I said, I will think of it in terms of standing for something, as Cheshire Calhoun writes, and this means instantiating our deeply held values in our behavior, attitudes, and ideally our inner life, and responding as they direct, especially in the face of temptation to do otherwise. It will also require standing up for something. It will require that we defend our values before others. Raymond Gator writes that the person of integrity stands fast in seriousness, and we can find him behind his words. He will put his name to a position, and he's prepared to be identified with it, not subordinating his own judgment to others, nor to expediency, comfort, or gain. In this way, integrity is a way of confirming and protecting our identity. Descriptions of integrity suggest activity and responses, or their refusal. So the person of integrity does or says or thinks certain things or refrains from them, and their integrity is tested and revealed in those activities or refusals. It therefore includes the notions of insincerity and a coherence between values, beliefs, expressions, and outward behavior. But given that none of us is perfect, it's got to be possible to have integrity while acknowledging one's faults and trying to improve oneself. And given that we reasonably change our lives, our minds, and our values over a lifetime, it must be compatible with moments of doubt, conflict, and quite profound change. So our notion of integrity has to be flexible, allowing for a kind of continual remaking of the self, as well as a capacity to balance competing commitments and values, and to take responsibility for one's work and thought. It is also it's also possible to lose integrity by caving into pressure or to other people's opinions. By not withstanding temptation, we can lose integrity and not just a subjective sense of it. So far, I've discussed integrity in formal terms. So someone has integrity if she stands by and for her commitments, regardless of their content. This means that some scenarios are possible. So first, a person of integrity could stand for non-moral values, like artistic or professional values. And this is important because it's reasonable for people to want lives that are personally rewarding, with partial relationships that matter and require attention, and with non-moral, individually important projects. We can stand for these personal commitments, and they are often what gives our lives substance and meaning. Second, as long as the relevant principles are significantly a person's own, they need not also be right. So a person can get things wrong and still have integrity. And third, a dedicated, strongly principled, but morally odious person could conceivably have integrity on such a formal account. Now, there's no conclusive argument in favor of substantial rather than a formal account, but we can point to integrity's role in our moral practices more generally. It's usually a term of praise, and so some substantial conditions in the content of principles seems called for. We do not want to have to end up praising a fanatic Nazi just because he's consistent and stands up for his principles. It will also be, I think, difficult to stand for a commitment publicly if it is morally despicable. But I can remain somewhat neutral on this issue because I'm going to be concerned throughout with morally acceptable values and principles, even if they are not themselves moral. Finally, and related to what I've just been saying, integrity does have an important social dimension. According to Calhoun, integrity requires responding properly to the sometimes diverging views of others. The person of integrity does not easily abandon her judgment to others, but she takes herself to be addressing them and to be concerned with values that everyone should be concerned with. Diverging views need to be taken seriously because we are involved in a common project to figure out what is worthwhile. She writes, anyone who regards herself as an equal in autonomous judgment to others cannot be indifferent to what others think. The person of integrity properly respects the social character of judgment and deliberation. And this gives us another reason for doubting that very immoral people could successfully stand for their vicious commitments before others. Calhoun, therefore, understands integrity primarily as a social virtue. She does not in fact think it's a personal virtue at all, because it is threatened by our vulnerability to other people. She says that without the social dimension, it ultimately reduces to standing by the line that demarcates self from not self, so that acting without integrity undermines the boundaries of the self, and that means that one's standing in relations to others drops out of the picture. Now, I agree that integrity is a matter of standing for something as an equal before and within a moral community. Yet I also think we should retain its fundamental personal dimension. If our core principles and commitments are partly constitutive of the self, then betraying them to the judgments of others is a way of dissolving the contours of the self, of losing what distinguishes you from others and gives your life its substance. Lynn McFall writes, without integrity and the identity conferring commitments it assumes, there would be nothing to fear the loss of, not because we are safe, but because we have nothing to lose. But as we see lately, both this personal and social dimension of integrity are important to my analysis, and they are related. So let's talk now about self-respect, which is also a very complex notion. And let's get to it by thinking firstly of respect. Now, respect is in the first instance a recognition of the nature and value of the object. In Kant's influential account, it is the appropriate response to the special value of rational humanity. We all, he says, possess a dignity or an absolute inner worth, which demands respect for others and for oneself. A person can therefore measure himself with every other being of this kind and value himself on a footing of equality with them. Self-respect, then, is the sense of being entitled to represent and claim rights for oneself, to be an equal participant and interlocutor in a community of moral equals. To lack self-respect is not to recognize one's actual worth, to act in ways contrary to that worth, or to subordinate one's worth to another. The servile person, says Kant, disavows his dignity and pursues his ends as if he were seeking a favor. On this account, we really are valuable, regardless of what we do, and losing self-respect refers only to a subjective sense of being unworthy that does not track an actual lasting value. It's clear that ideologies and systems based on racial inequality as in apartheid, disregard and undermine both respect for others and self-respect, and it is clear that any just society must foster it. John Rawls calls self-respect the most important of the primary social goods and a characteristic which a just society will foster. Transitions to a just society need to ensure that this kind of self-respect is supported. Drawing on the work of Stephen Darwell, Robin Dillon has called this kind of self-respect recognition self-respect, and she then distinguishes it from what she calls evaluative self-respect. The latter involves an appreciation of one's earned worth, a positive appraisal of one's quality as a person in light of the standards given in one's self-ideal. It is still moral appraisal, and in that way contrasts with self-esteem. The notion of evaluative self-respect reminds us that we respect ourselves as concrete, particular individuals. Dillon writes elsewhere that is not just as abstract human beings or as agents of personal and universalized moral goals and obligations that individuals can, do, or should respect themselves, but also as concrete persons embedded in particular social structures and occupying various social positions with status-related responsibilities that they must meet to be self-respecting. Evaluative self-respect also seems to involve and require integrity, where integrity is living up to and standing for those standards on which one's self-conception is grounded. Evaluative self-respect could then be a response to the recognition that we've shown integrity. Unlike recognition self-respect, we can lose it as well. If we really do fall below our reasonable standards, we will justifiably lose the sense that we've earned further respect, even if we retain recognition self-respect of ourselves as simply persons. We would feel shame if we fall below our self-ideal. Gabrielle Taylor, in fact, sees shame as a protective emotion that safeguards our self-respect, setting limits to what we consider doing. A person has no self-respect if he regards no circumstances as shame-producing, she writes. Of these kinds of self-respect, recognition of self-respect is perhaps the most fundamental. Without it, as Rawls writes, nothing may seem worth doing. But insofar as evaluative self-respect is connected to one's sense of particular historically situated individuality and identity, losing it can also be deeply damaging. And I'm going to argue that both recognition and evaluative self-respect of the privileged are vulnerable under conditions of systemic racial injustice, once they recognize the facts of it. Like integrity, self-respect has an important social dimension. Both integrity and self-respect involve having a proper relation to yourself and to others. And how one feels towards oneself is deeply affected by how one relates to others and to their view of oneself. Self-respect is sensitive to the way that others regard us and can be damaged by continuous misrecognition, denigration, or discrimination from others. At the same time, as David Middleton writes, a self-respecting person is one who not only expects to receive respect from others, but has the basis of respecting themselves. In other words, the assertion of moral worth is precisely recognition of ourselves as a proper object of respect. So with those rough accounts in mind, I want to explore the effect that acknowledging racial privilege can have on those self-regarding virtues. so the question now is, how should racially privileged people think about themselves and others in their systemically still unjust society? What kind of work on the self is required? Now, most importantly, I think that taking the views of those adversely affected by injustice is a moral requirement. The privileged should listen to and respect the views of those with whom they hope to build better relations. The consequence of this is that they need to see themselves as their less privileged fellow citizens see them. Accepting the views of these important others, recognizing the meanings of privilege and their significance to one's sense of selves and others, I call taking privilege to heart. For a white person, taking privilege to heart requires fully appreciating the meanings of whiteness, how it is embedded in social structures in ways that are often invisible to them, taking responsibility for that privilege and for membership of a morally and politically problematic group. It means, in other words, accepting one's group identity. This is to accept that the negative meanings of white privilege apply to each one of us, not only to those who are crudely and obviously racist. In taking all of this to heart, we learn to see ourselves as those who are less privileged often justifiably see us, to see ourselves from the outside as inescapably and most significantly members of groups with problematic histories and meanings. This external view might not cohere with how we think of ourselves, and so there are plenty of opportunities for self-deception and moral shirking. There may, for instance, be a more or less plausible story to be told, which would exempt us from straightforward causal responsibility, and there will be a great temptation to accept it. And here we can recall Tessman's privilege of thinking well of ourselves. Taking responsibility might then itself be a moral choice, a choice of a certain view of our place in a community, the significance of group membership and of our relations to others. Recall that our notion of integrity must allow for flexibility, for a kind of continual remaking of the self. To maintain integrity in these circumstances, we need to remake the self and not simply to retain all aspects of the self. This project of taking to heart has a complex relation to the self-regarding virtues that I've been talking about. A morally conscientious person will feel that these virtues are threatened under unjust conditions and that they require some work on the self. And the process of taking to heart itself seems to be one of partially restoring them. Assuming we accept the wrongs of injustice and our implication in it, we are required to stand for this commitment. Evaluative self-respect also requires living up to our standards of moral excellence, and this includes recognizing the real harms of injustice. Our sense of ourselves as equally valuable to others, our recognition self-respect, might be sensitive to this project as well. Note to the personal and social dimensions of both these virtues. We are concerned with our relation to others whose judgment matters to us, for presenting to them our commitment. And our sense of ourselves as decent, consistent, or non-hypocritical is at stake. Undertaking this project, living it through, is both the restoration and expression of a more ideal sense of self. But on the other hand, taking to heart also seems to put pressure on and threatens to undermine self-respect and integrity. It requires a self-scrutiny that can damage our self-conception. And this is because recognition of whiteness and privilege now positions us as being in the wrong, independently of what we've done. In the eyes of many others, we are significantly nothing but our race. We know that we are perceived as a certain kind of person, as entitled or privileged, and we might in fact be such a person. And that's why I think it's appropriate to feel shame, and why integrity and evaluative self-respect might be threatened. It can feel like that there's no gap between our racial identity and ourselves. We are white or racially privileged, and that is of fundamental significance to others. and if we take their views seriously to ourselves. Taking up this external view, our being collapses into our faults, and this collapse, as suggests, leads to a more profound diminishment of integrity and self-respect. This is a collapse into moral inequality. We cannot act and converse as moral equals. Evaluative self-respect diminishes because we have failed to display integrity, to act in the ways required by our moral standards and self-conception. Recognition and self-respect may diminish as we feel diminished among others. We might retain a theoretical belief in our Kantian self-respect and our Kantian worth with others, but I think that it might be difficult to be practically operative. Sorry, I'm just going back to my notes. It therefore seems that the very attempt to maintain or restore integrity and self-respect leads to us having to take seriously views of the self that undermine them. And it can lead to a self that might be difficult to live with. And this is an odd, rather destabilizing position to come to if we think that these self-regarding virtues are necessary for restoring moral relations with others and with ourselves. Now, there are a number of ways of responding to this analysis so far, and I'm going to look at a few of them. Doing so will enable me to complicate the analysis a little bit, and it will also allow us to think more deeply about these virtues in non-ideal conditions. And I think it will also allow us to think about whether there might be justifiable limits to these kinds of personal projects. So let me look at a couple of responses. One response is just to dismiss my worries and to say, well, so what? Some might say that this is how it should be, and the privileged must learn to live with a damaged self. Their energy and efforts should be directed outwards towards making the lives of the less privileged better. If this requires personal discomfort and material sacrifice, so be it. To this, I have three replies. And the first is that it's just a bit too quick to say this. Privilege is systemic and structural, and social and economic conditions take a long time to change, and in ways not always directly correlated to individual action. Problems are not all of our own making. The responsibility is political and dispersed. We are positioned in privilege and do not only position ourselves. And I think this means that a morally conscientious person should be able to live with herself, even if uncomfortably and critically. The second reply is that the response misses an important dimension of the good life. We saw that integrity involves more than moral commitments. We act with integrity when we further those partial personal projects which contribute so much to our flourishing, including relationships and special interests. I've said that this is reasonable. Giving up on them or drastically reducing the time and resources we give to them in order to further the cause of justice and fortify a sense of self-respect could be another way of diminishing integrity. And that again is at least troubling. Thirdly, typically self-respect and integrity work together and typically in one direction. I mean here that a person will lose self-respect if she acts in ways that damage her integrity, and she will gain self-respect if she responds with integrity. Typically then, integrity affects self-respect, and self-respect can help us to act with integrity. Here, however, they seem to come apart. Standing up for personal commitments can undermine the self-respect that seeks out justice, for instance. And again, this is troubling for accounts of the self-regarding virtues which assume a coherence between them. What is required by the one should not be in tension with the requirements of others. So that is why I think that first response might be a little bit too quick. Another response begins from the fact of systemic injustice and takes it in a more conciliatory direction. It says that I'm not giving enough weight to the fact that racial injustice is systemic and therefore that personal responsibility is diffuse. Because racialized injustice is embedded in social structures, our moral position is both more complex and more conducive to the virtues. We are assuming that the privileged are not in the position by choice and cannot change all aspects of it merely by an act of will. Certain privileges will attend them whether they like it or not. This seems to take some responsibility out of their hands, thus enabling the maintenance of self-respect and integrity. And in another paper, Cheshire Calhoun seems to say something like this, although she's responding to a slightly different issue. She's engaging with Lisa Tessman's view that sensitivity to the suffering of the oppressed is both a virtue and potentially psychologically crippling. It is what she calls a burdened virtue. And in response, Calhoun writes this: systemically produced suffering is not the sort of suffering that one can address effectively through individual action. The solutions have to be collective, involving changes in social behaviors, practices, and institutions. If we choose not to help some, we are implicated causally in continuing suffering, not as individuals, but as members of a collective we, which has failed to address a moral problem. Recognizing this, ourselves may be less implicated and the virtues less threatened. I think that this is correct for the virtue of sensitivity to systemically produced suffering, but I don't think that that takes us very far. I've tried to show how taking privilege to heart includes recognizing ourselves as certain kinds of persons in the eyes of others. Taking that view seriously means accepting that our group identity is a crucial dimension of who we are. We must take responsibility for who we are. Repudiating responsibility for what we have no control over or what did not originate from choice will remove most of ourselves from our responsibility. That would be to see ourselves not as agents at all, but as passive recipients of influences. And this is also a point to which Tessman's privilege of thinking well of ourselves can assert itself yet again. Building further on Tessman's work here, another response would be to argue that integrity and self-respect are examples themselves of the burdened virtues. Virtues that under conditions of oppression are burdensome to their bearers. They come at a significant psychological and ethical cost, and therefore do not contribute to flourishing in the way that standard or eudaimonistic conceptions of virtue require. Virtue and flourishing here are disjoined. Now, once we have such a category of virtue, and Tessman gives a good case in favor of such a category, we could characterize self-respect and integrity in their terms. They are good traits of character and give their bearer nobility, hence remain virtues. But under conditions of systemic injustice, they are also burdensome. Calling for perfect versions of them ignores the reality of non-ideal conditions and assumes that moral purity is possible. And in non-ideal conditions, that is, many virtues will be burdened, and this is to be expected. In some respect, perhaps, self-respect and integrity under the conditions I describe are burdened in this way. Their pursuit and maintenance is morally necessary, but also painful because of the view of the self they seem to require. But I think there are further dimensions that separate them from Tessman's notion. First, not only is the attempt to retain or rebuild them painful, and many moral tasks can be painful and self-undermining, but the process they require can itself undermine those very virtues. In contrast, what is intrinsically required by courage or compassion or generosity do not undermine those virtues themselves, even in systemically unjust conditions. Second, Tessman writes that the notion of burdened virtues include all those traits that contribute to human flourishing only because they enable survival of or resistance to oppression. This is not the case for self-respect and integrity. They are generally ethically necessary, not just in conditions of oppression. Third, integrity and self-respect are not virtues in the way that the typical Aristotelian virtues are. Bernard Williams writes of integrity that while it is an admirable human property, it is not related to motivation as the virtues are. It is not a disposition which itself yields motivations, as generosity and benevolence do. Instead, and this isn't really how Williams puts it, these are my terms, they underlie and support the cultivation of the other virtues, burdened or otherwise. So they seem to me to be more fundamental and their erosion more destabilizing for one's sense as a moral agent. Failing to exercise a virtue, say compassion, need not undermine one's basic sense of decency. Losing integrity or evaluative self-respect, suspecting that recognition self-respect is unjustified, are self-destructive in this different kind of way. So for those reasons, I don't think that the notion of the burden virtues can capture everything we need to capture. Finally, another response has to do with the role of stereotyping in my account so far. And this response says that I've gone wrong by characterizing the moral project of taking privilege to heart in terms of a reduction to group identity. Being reduced practically to one trait, especially when this has to do with group membership, does damage to the particularity of persons. It is one of the mechanisms and costs of prejudice which a project of justice should avoid, not require. Whether this reduction is intentionally imposed by others or by oneself, it involves a masking of individuality, as Larry Blum writes. Stereotyping involves seeing individual members through a narrow and rigid lens of group-based image, rather than being alive to the range of characteristics constituting each member as a distinct individual. The reduction of white South African to white privilege, even if she does it to herself, is a reduction to group identity and a denial of ethically significant individuality. As a result, it damages self-respect. That this is precisely what happened to Black people in apartheid South Africa does not make it any more right. To reject stereotyping is to insist that no project that undermines recognition self-respect can be morally required. If taking privilege to heart has this effect, then it has gone too far. Nobody loses actual moral worth. We remain the kinds of creatures to whom respect and self-respect is due, even if we don't feel it. Respecting ourselves is then insisting on this moral fact. We can retain recognition self-respect, even if evaluative self-respect is appropriately bruised by taking privilege to heart. I think that this is right. And I also think that recognition of respect is required for any moral project to get off the ground and to be sustained. We do need a boundary between self and group. However, if the project I've described today makes sense, and I've described it very schematically, but if the rough outlines of it are plausible, I worry that when the self is importantly defined by unjust privilege, the distinction between evaluative and recognition self-respect is blurred. Failing to be the kind of person we aspire to be, the threat to evaluative self-respect, is also a failure to be the moral equal to others in less privileged positions. So that blurring seems to me a danger when we take the view of ourselves as importantly members of a particular group. So the upshot of all this is that if we value integrity and self-respect and consider them to be parts of an admirable character, we are left with a problem. When we are privileged in conditions of structural injustice, integrity and self-respect seem to require that we take to heart our morally dubious situation, and yet we are in certain respects morally damaged by just that project. And as I promised at the start, I'm not going to reach any solution to this problem, but in conclusion, I want to think about where this might leave us, and to see what we need to think a little bit more about. So, let me just make a few points then. We can conclude that the demands of justice and personal work on the self must avoid collapsing the self to group identity. The view that is rejected by Calhoun, that integrity has to do with maintaining the boundaries of the self, sounds plausible. If taking to heart means such a claustrophobic closeness to our public identity, there is something to the thought that a healthy self-relation maintains certain boundaries, allows a gap between self and group identity. So any personal project of taking privilege to heart seems to meet a limit in the need to retain, at least, recognition, self-respect. Secondly, besides difficult personal consequences, there are troubling social and political consequences of such a collapse. Constructive conversation, for instance, is only possible when interlocutors consider themselves to be equals, and this is impossible for those without self-respect and integrity. Not being able to value oneself, to trust one's judgment, not being able to stand up for one's beliefs before others, makes fruitful conversations and joint effort difficult. If we think that our fellows ignore all our qualities besides privilege, and if we see those others only as critics, shared and good-willed effort to improve our overlapping world becomes more difficult. And finally, what this shows, I think, is that we need a very complex moral psychology to track the requirements, assumptions, and conditions for rehabilitating character in non-ideal contexts. As part of that, we need a complex account of the self-defining virtues that recognize the difficulty of sustaining them in conditions of systemic injustice, and recognizes their sensitivity to stereotyping and the demands of group identity. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you so much, Samantha. That left a lot of things to think about, I would say. The delicate connections between self-respect, integrity, and privilege in a racially imperfect world, and also the tension between the self and the community that arises from that again. Thank you very much. We really did enjoy that. So if you do have questions, comments, please feel free to raise your digital hand or put them in the chat, and we'll be able to have some conversation before we end the lecture. Yeah, and perhaps I might begin with this very interesting idea of taking privilege to heart, and how that is quite different from accepting or not even acknowledging privilege in the first place. But is it when one takes privilege to heart and become very sort of evaluative of it, it is, in a sense, does that mean that we are not accepting that privilege? We are being critical of it, and as you said, remaking oneself rather than retaining that privilege. Perhaps just a few more words on that, I would say.
Yes, I use the phrase taking to heart because it does seem to me that there's a difference between admitting something in theoretical terms and taking it on as a practical project to deeply recognize it. So to take something to heart is not just to accept the claim that we may be privileged, but to actually deeply appreciate what that means in a certain kind of a society. And I think that that requires thinking about its meanings to other people and how we are seen by other people. And I think that that is uncomfortable enough to be called a kind of sinking in or a realization of something that is a truth about ourselves. So that's the way I think about it. I also think taking something to heart means it becomes then practically operative in other ways of being. So it infiltrates the way we then respond to others and go about the world. So it's practically deep in that sense as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Sam. Wayne?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm not a philosopher at all, and perhaps I'm missing something rather fundamental. But I wondered if my question relates to Elvis's question about taking privilege to heart. And I kind of wondered what that means in real terms. So does it mean specifically a sort of privileged white person says, yes, I'm privileged, and, then what? So what does it mean for the person's actual behavior? Does it mean you kind of give up your big car and nice house? What does it mean for real life is, I guess, what I'm wondering. And then a kind of another sort of perhaps comments to a question. You seem to be, these sort of notions of integrity, self-respect, and so forth. You're describing a kind of, as you, I think yourself said, you're describing a sort of ideal person or an ideal condition. Such people don't exist in the real world. Somebody who's has absolute integrity in all aspects or all spheres of life. You speak about, a person has no self-respect if it regards no circumstances as shame-producing. I think that you quoted somebody else saying that. But, a couple of issues with that. One is, there's no sort of universal definition of shame, even, across societies, but even within one society. So no universal definition of what shame means or what is regarded as shameful behavior. And so certain kinds of behavior in one community is regarded as shameful. Other kinds of communities don't see it like that at all. So, we can think of all kinds of specific examples: drinking to excess, dacha smoking, etc., etc. These things don't mean the same things to different people. And I sort of just kind of wonder, where does this sort of ideal person exist, and what are the definitions that we use for these labels of self-respect, integrity? These philosophical definitions are not the same definitions that sort of ordinary people apply to their real lives.
Thanks. When there's a lot of questions there, I'll try and remember them. Firstly, what does this mean for what we actually do in the world? Which is a fair question. I guess my first concern here is with what I'm calling work on the self, and I do take that, at least in the first instance, to be a kind of private matter, a way of trying to rethink one's values, one's conceptions, one's beliefs. We can do that with other people, conversations, and we probably need to, but I do think there's an important internal dimension to this, right? I'm also assuming, I guess, that will spill out into the way one engages with people in the world at some point. I do take it there to be some kind of relation to how we are inside and how we deal with other people. But if you like, you can think of this as an enabling condition for further practical work in the world with other people. And in that way, it remains an imaginative project, if you like, imaginative, self-directed project. You're quite right that I'm not giving you any definitions of shame. I'm not giving you a precise definition of integrity or self-respect either. I'm rather trying to sort of map out very complex concepts that I think are really cluster concepts involving a lot of connections with related concepts in that way. But I'm hoping that the kind of internal conversation I was sort of tracking in this paper at least sounds plausible and makes sense of the sort of thing that somebody could be thinking through. So while different people will have different commitments and their sense of self will meet limits in different ways, I'm still hoping that the overall rough contours of this kind of internal conversation have resonance to other people. So shame, what people are ashamed about does obviously differ. But if the notion of standing up for whatever it is that is important to one makes sense, then I'm hoping that there's some entry point for other people here. So that's a start of an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sam. Paul, and then Jason.
Great. Thanks so much, Samantha. That was really, really, really fascinating. So this is just a question to get more of a sense from your intellectual motivations about how integrity might be conceptualized at a more foundational level than at the kind of level that, say, Bernard Williams operates at, which is looking at literature produced by people like Jay Bernstein writing on torture and moral injury. They often talk about the idea that with particularly intense violations of integrity, you've got the extent to which the self can be unmade and devastated to the point where it's unrecoverable. And I wonder from how because I noticed that you've referenced Darwall, which was interesting, because Darwall's second personal reasons account seems to almost lend itself open to the idea that actually what we're talking about when we're talking about integrity is that we're moving away from discourses of normativity that center ideas of authority to centering ideas about responsibility. And do you think, for example, if we start focusing on ideas about responsibility rather than ideas about authority, it means that actually when we start thinking about integrity, we aren't necessarily worrying about the liberal framework of shame. We're attending to the more foundational points about the care of the self and attending to the primary harms of racial injustice on subjectivities, for example, and things like that.
Goodness, yes. There's a lot to say there, and I'm not going to do justice to those very interesting questions. I might ask you to maybe email me and write them up.
Sure, no problem.
I have come across the work of on moral damage through torture, for instance. I haven't yet decided what to do with it or used it in my work, but it certainly is suggestive. I suppose what I'm undertaking in this talk is, if you like, at least partly intentional and conscious project that leads to some forms of moral damage rather than quite the same sort of conditions that literature sometimes speaks of.
Right.
But what I am suggesting that is if we take consciously on such a project, there might come a point at which we have to stop, or we meet limits precisely in order to not completely undo the self and to keep some kind of healthy boundary for it. So I think there's definitely something there to think further about. That's why I think this notion of integrity is setting the boundaries for the self, that we can kind of retain some kind of gap between ourselves and what we're so affected by is really important. That might partly relate to what Cheshire Calhoun says in response to Lisa Tessman and responding to the suffering of others. But I need to think this through. Yes, the project of working on the self and the notion of taking responsibility for the self. I've become, I guess, over the years, more aware of how work on the self is so related to the way we think other people see us and how we think of our proper relations, second personal relations amongst them, the people. What that does for a deeper ethical account is sort of what Darwin is doing. I'm not yet sure. I would need to think about that. And maybe you have something to say here about that. I'd be really interested to hear it.
I hopefully it's coherent, sure, but I think I can certainly come back to you afterwards, Samantha.
Yes, please do. I'd like that.
We've got a hand that I don't want to keep waiting.
Thank you for that, though.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Jason?
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Oh, no.
Hi, Jason.
Sorry, Sam. I had a temporary, I think I'm coherent. So there were two things that I just thought were noteworthy, and you've hit something that's kind of at the center of my own current spiral. So one reason to push back against the so what that pops up is that the value of integrity would be a sort of a fixed point to aim towards, because what hits me is that these things don't hit us as a simple existential challenge to how we defined our character. They're recurrent instances of moral shock. And that can trigger that servility or self-defensive response when they hit us in different occasions. So one of the reasons to hold on to that instinct you have for why we want to not give in too quickly to the so what is that integrity lets us regroup or reorient ourselves back toward why these concerns are relevant. It's easy to be discombobulated by the sudden realization. And when I say sudden realization, sorry, what I mean is that you didn't explicitly mention epistemic virtue, which I think is probably, and I can see why it's entailed, but that is also seems to be partially constitutive of those self-constituting virtues. Integrity is about seeing that we track the world properly. The reason I mention all of this is because this comes to my mind recently when I realized just recently that some set of my responses in publicly responding to moral issues were calloused and stereotyped and functioning reactively in ways that I thought were a settled part of my political responses, and they weren't. And my response to that is something like inactivity or being stunned or being servile. And what allows me to recognize that it's not servility is recognizing that it's a recalibration of my epistemic response. And what you're pointing to is that the integrity helps us understand that when we've miscalculated our responses and need to reevaluate once again, that's the action we're doing. We're seeking to track a sort of epistemic integrity. And I'm sorry, I think I just traveled a bit there.
No, that's interesting. Thank you. So you're thinking of concern with integrity and as a kind of self-collection and reiteration for the self of what is important in a way that tracks the real political reality, something like that.
Yes, and framing or that a recognition of privilege is necessarily a recognition of a kind of epistemic misunderstanding that we attempt to pass. But some of these things can be framed, and I'm not saying this is a flaw of yours, but some of these things can be framed as though they're stable dispositions to evaluate or to see. And they really, emerge as a series of shocks and realizations that can be quite difficult to engage with. So what you're trying to salvage is the sense that it's our reorienting that is the consistent part of integrity there.
Jason, thank you. That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of what I was doing in terms of the epistemic virtues. Now that you suggest that, it sounds exactly right. Because taking to heart is partly a recognition of something that I should have known before, if you like, a recalibrating of how I see the world. And I guess epistemic virtues like an openness to taking into account the views of others, which is built into integrity. So there seems to be an overlap, a very clear overlap there that I hadn't thought through at all. So thank you. Yes, that's helpful. There's an epistemic and the ethical project are intertwined here. And I guess, part of a virtue epistemic approach is just to show that ethics and epistemology can be intertwined exactly in these ways. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, okay. There are no questions in the chat. I think there's one. Arabia, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Sam, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I wonder, especially coming from an African perspective, that is me coming from an African perspective, where things like reparations are very, very important. Given that this privilege you're speaking of is one that stems from forms of oppression, I wonder if taking this privilege to heart and starting from a subjective point of view in terms of internalizing it and then trying to figure out how you would act in the world by yourself. I wonder if that would be the appropriate approach rather than a much more objective approach where understanding that privilege and understanding where that privilege comes from allows you to identify ways of correcting or repairing the sort of broken relationships that emerge from the oppression that leads to the privilege you're talking about. So what I'm asking is, I wonder if there are much more practical, objective ways to take privilege to heart that go beyond just merely figuring out yourself internally or subjectively how you're supposed to respond to others in the world, especially those who are, in this case, less privileged.
Thank you, Arabia. Yes, that's a very natural response to this kind of talk. At the end of the day, if we want to change the world, why spend so much time thinking in these terms? I don't think the kind of work of the self that I've been interested in should stay internal. I think undertaking it might reveal aspects of changing relations with other people, and it might show us what we actually should do. For example, if we're going to take the view of others seriously, then maybe we should actually go out and talk to other people, other groups of people, get involved with various civil society groups or political groups to do that. That would seem to be a natural next step. So I think they're perfectly compatible. I see this as a first step. I don't see it as a step that could be skipped over, though. I think if we're thinking of justice, not just in terms of social and economic distribution, for instance, but as actually the mending of relations between people, then this kind of self-reflection and, if possible, remaking of the self seems to me a necessary condition for that. So I think we should go further than just sitting and talking to ourselves, if you like. I don't see the project as incompatible, though. That would be a start.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And finally, Paul.
Yeah, this is just a quick follow-up to Aribia's very interesting question, because I wondered, Samantha, where you stand on the concepts that were articulated, particularly in early noughties critical social epistemology by people like Noon, focusing on race traitors. But this is not the standard notion of a race traitor with the eponymous journal. It's more the kind of notion of race traitors developed by Mab Segrest, focusing on the idea that what you do is out of concern for principally the integrity of racially minoritized groups. It's not just simply being aware of privilege, it's about sundering connections to privilege through the development of, as well, things like epistemic reparations as well. Is this an area of research that you have in mind that you think your project can touch onto, or is it taking it into two different directions at this moment in time?
I'm not sure. I haven't read new work on race traitors. I obviously know the original work. So what's been done with it recently, I'm not sure. I have a problem with the very radical notion of being a traitor to race, which seems to require cutting ties with people who are part of one's community. I think that is, if that is what's required, it probably is too drastic. But I haven't thought in those terms recently at all. So I would have to first think and then get back to you on that. I'm not sure how far I would push that terminology, but I haven't thought it through.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, one thing, I guess, the view of being a traitor to a race seems to let go of a project of trying to be better in respect of all the people in one's world, not just repudiating people, but standing in some kind of good community with them as well. I'm not quite sure how to bring that in conversation with standing in better relations to other people in other communities. I'm just not sure. Then a new complexity to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And Sam, if you don't mind, Wayne?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to come back to this sort of notion that you had earlier about the relationship with the self. And I wondered, I wondered if you could kind of share some ideas on what that might look like in the real terms, because I was thinking, are most religious people not permanently, people who are practitioners of all kinds of religions, sort of permanently engaged in a sort of relationship with themselves around these issues of integrity, self-respect, and all the ones that you've identified. And I sort of just wondered how that might be different from what you are aiming at or describing.
I don't think it need be different. I think it is definitely one kind of work on the self. And the notion of work on the self has very strong history in religious traditions and in also in ancient ethics. So I see them as belonging to the same family, actually. Yeah. In fact, years back, my work really in this area started from thinking about ancient and religious conceptions of spiritual exercises, for instance, that you find in a lot of the early church fathers, in Plato, in the Stoics. So it comes out of that tradition.
But then from what you describing, it seems like something's missing, though. I mean, that these practices are not resulting in sort of the necessary self-awareness around issues of privilege and so forth.
Which practices, sorry?
Well, any kind of religious practice, any kind of religious practice that involves, making oneself a better person.
I guess if they were pushed through, they would require some kind of engagement with injustice, and there'll be different kinds of injustice one could engage with. Unfortunately, we live in a world where there are many types to choose from. So I guess a continuous process of self-reflection and work on the self would broaden out into further parts of society. I guess it would meet practical limits at some point. You know, there's probably only so much we can take on board, but I see it as part of the same project.
Interesting. Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for a really beautiful paper that obviously the questions show that it leaves a lot to think about. It's really interesting conversation, I would say, so far. And thank you for finding the time to join today and to give this talk. So we look forward to the next talk in January. Usually we won't have talks in December. And you can always access this lecture and others on the YouTube channel for the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies. So thank you all for joining. Do have a wonderful weekend, and Sam, enjoy your weekend. As you said, it's quite hot in South Africa at the moment, so hope you can enjoy it while we enjoy the cold here in the UK. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.
Appreciate your time. And appreciate you giving up your Friday afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.